Hello and welcome to this Bay TV Liverpool election special. I'm Liam Fogarty, and over the next hour we'll bring you results and reaction from across our region. We'll hear from many of the winners and losers from this remarkable election, and we'll have a roundup of what's been happening where you live. Well, no one saw this coming, and after all that talk of a hung parliament, it's the Conservatives who've emerged as the largest party. David Cameron is poised to move into number 10 again, and his party is on the verge of an outright majority at Westminster. In this part of the world, the Tories captured Vale of Clwyd from Labour, and they held on to the highly marginal seat of Weaver Vale, but they lost in Wirral West and in the city of Chester. Both were Labour gains, and the Labour Party retained seats in places like Liverpool and St Helens with significantly increased majorities. As you probably know by now, the Liberal Democrats have had a truly horrible election. They've lost seats and deposits all over the country, but they did at least manage to hold on to Southport. UKIP boosted their vote across the region with a second-place finish in Knowsley, but no parliamentary seats. The Greens also picked up votes, coming second in Liverpool Riverside. With me in the studio, some of the politicians who've been up all night. We'll hear what they have to say about the results and about what they mean for people here. We start our coverage in Wirral West. It was always going to be a close contest, with Labour anxious to unseat the Conservative Esther McVey. She finished about 400 votes behind the Labour candidate, Margaret Greenwood.
Well, that's how politics works. I always knew I was taking on a tight marginal seat. It was tight in 2005, I lost. In 2010, I won. In 2015, I've
just checking
lost.
Greenwood.
But you know what?
What went wrong?
Well, I increased my share of the vote, but the people of Wirral West spoke. I wanted to come home and represent my area. I was the only Conservative MP on Merseyside, and it just shows we've got a lot more to do. At the end of the day, I believe in politics. I want to represent a constituency again. You know, you have your highs, you have your lows in politics, but you know what? I'm going to pick myself back up, dust myself down, and I'm going back out there to become an MP because I believe in the Conservative Party and I believe in all it stands for. So you ain't seen the last of me yet.
Esther McVey, the former Member of Parliament for Wirral West. Hers was a prized scalp for her Labour opponents, and indeed her opponent, Margaret Greenwood, won with a majority of just over 400 votes. Lots of other things to talk about this morning. There's some familiar faces returned. Liverpool's quintet of Labour MPs are all back in office. John Pugh held on in Southport for the Lib Dems, and there have been some new faces. Mrs Greenwood in Wirral West we've heard about, but also people like Conor McGinn in St Helens North, and a familiar face, I suppose, in St Helens South and Wiston, and that is Mary Rimmer, former leader of St Helens Council. Time to talk to a couple of our guests initially. Pat Maloney is a Liberal Democrat. You can probably tell that by the enormous rosette and the tie. Pat was the Liberal Democrats' candidate in Liverpool Walton. And Patrick Hurley is a member of Liverpool City Council. He's a Labour member in the Mossley Hill and Egmouth ward, and he's defending that seat today when they count those votes in the local elections. I'll start with you, Patrick, if I may. Did you see this coming in your worst nightmares?
I was expecting nothing of the sort. The worst I thought Labour would do is that maybe we would be 10, 20 seats behind the Tories at worst. I was expecting actually that we would be able to form some sort of government. Not in my worst nightmares would I have anywhere near expected the bloodbath that we saw last night.
But we've seen in Liverpool and Bootle and St Helens, places like that, traditional Labour areas, you've been piling up votes, but not getting them in the places where you need them in the home counties and the suburbs. How do you explain that?
Earlier this morning in his acceptance speech, David Cameron said that he is Prime Minister for one nation, one kingdom. And I think what you're saying there, it just shows that he's just entirely wrong, completely out of touch. This isn't in any sense one nation anymore. The country is more fragmented. more divided than it's been for decades and decades. We're seeing that because locally, Labour Party is racking up huge majorities. Local people in Liverpool and across the city region want to see a Labour government. The rest of the country seem not to agree.
Pat Maloney, it's been an absolutely terrible night to be a Liberal Democrat. You, I think, finished in fifth place. You were second last time around, I think. Yes. Do you ask yourself, what's the point in going on when you have a set of results like the ones we've seen?
Well, clearly it has been a devastating night for the Liberal Democrats. And I wouldn't say it's been a great shock. If we've looked at the local results for 2011, 2012, and 2014, the message has been clear. And if you remember, as Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, said 2 or 3 years ago, in a coalition, it's always the smaller party that comes off worse with the electorate. And that's clearly happened. I think if you look at the longer term, over the wider picture, I think I agree with Patrick Hurley that the country is more divided. If you look what's happened in Scotland, where the SNP have completely routed Labour and the Lib Dems pretty much, I think the legacy here, David Cameron's legacy, is going to be the continued breakup of the United Kingdom. And I think the way that the Conservatives have played the frightener card about the SNP and their effect if there was going to be a Labour SNP coalition, I think that's been absolutely reprehensible, and I think has been really damaging to the continued unity of the United Kingdom.
But in terms of your party's performance, when you've gone door to door in Liverpool, Walton, with your rosette, what have people been saying to you?
Well, clearly the Labour vote has solidified in Walton, and clearly people have not been happy with Nick Clegg going into coalition with the Conservatives. And I think people's perception has been that the Lib Dem break on Conservatives in government, in the coalition, hasn't been as strong as it should have been.
Patrick, the question now, I suppose, is going to turn to who's going to lead the Labour Party nationally. It's been pretty much a given that Ed Miliband did okay on a personal basis. People seem to warm to him. He gained credibility throughout the campaign. But has that kind of evaporated, given the really, really damaging results from this election?
I think it has evaporated completely. It's not just Ed Miliband that needs to go, though. I think it's a whole approach across the Labour Party. We need to listen to what the country's been telling us last night. We need to go back, rethink again what the party's standing for, rethink again how we can best serve the working people of the UK. I don't think actually that we should rush to judgment. We should take time to decide what people are actually telling us, or to understand what people are telling us. The last thing I think we need is a leadership campaign being launched later today, early next week. Let's reflect on what people are telling us. Let's make slow, deliberative decisions after that.
Well, it wasn't all bad news, and maybe you need to talk to the likes of your successful candidate in Wirral West, and she is Margaret Greenwood, who beat Esther McVeigh, as we've heard. Let's hear from her now. the result in Wirral West, again for Labour, which means that the entire Wirral Peninsula is now in Labour hands because they retained their seat in Wallasey with Angela Eagle. Birkenhead, Frank Field increased his majority there. Wirral South was always a bit touch and go. The Conservatives fancied unseating Alison McGovern. They failed to do so, and her majority went up, I think, about eightfold. So a big night for Labour in Wirral. Pat Maloney, what was striking about the Liberal Democrat performance, it seems to me, is that your vote didn't just kind of go down, it kind of collapsed, and you're taking second, third and fourth places now, where you used to finish in second places, and yours is a case in point. When you see parties like the Greens overtaking you, like UKIP overtaking you, does this bode ill for the Lib Dems at a local level, where they've always, you know, prided themselves on having a kind of grassroots approach and building up power over time?
Well, I think you raise an interesting point there, Liam. And if you look out there, I think the perception amongst the electorate is that we are no longer in a two-party system. The perception now is that we're in a multi-party system, and however the electoral system has not come to grips with that. So we're looking at a Conservative party that's going to have, it's looking like a majority or close to majority government on about a third of the vote. Now, you've got to question the legitimacy of that, and I'm sure we will hear post-election increasing calls from both the Greens, UKIP and obviously the smaller nationalist parties for significant electoral reform so that the system actually represents the views of the people.
Well, we'll talk about the implications for the voting system a little later in the programme, because we will be joined by a Conservative candidate to get their voice, and they, after all, as a party, are the big winners in this election. I just want to ask you, Patrick, really, about the lessons that you and your colleagues in the north of England can apply to colleagues in other parts of the country who've taken a bit of a beating. What lessons they learned from you?
The only real lesson is not to take the electorate for granted. I think across the north of England, and especially in the Liverpool City region, we're a year-long campaigning organisation. We make sure that we go out, that we're listening to what people are telling us, that we act in accordance with people's wishes. The last thing that we need to do as a party is to take people's vote for granted. It's said that that's what happened in Scotland over the last few years, and we saw that we were reaping the whirlwind last night. That's really the only lesson that I can impart to anybody else.
We do have a map of our city region to give us an idea of where the big results were last night. You'll notice an enormous blob of red. It's Liverpool, it's the two St Helens constituencies, Knowsley there, George Howarth re-elected. The little outpost of yellow, Pat, that's John Pugh, your colleague in Southport, beating off a challenge from the Conservatives there. Wirral, as I say, the entire peninsula now in Labour hands. The Conservatives, they've held on to Edinburgh, and they've also held on to Weaver Vale, which I know was a Labour target seat, but the Conservatives hang on to that. And over there in the west, deep into Wales, Vale of Clwyd, which was a Conservative gain. Chris Rowan, the Labour MP there, ousted by James Davis. But, you know, you're talking about a divided country. There's a divided city region, and a few lessons maybe that we can talk about later in the programme. We mentioned Southport. John Pugh there had a majority of about 6,000 at the last election. He was under pressure from the Conservatives and also from a very strong UKIP challenger. But on a night of disastrous results for the Lib Dems, Mr. Pugh survives to fight another day, and perhaps we can hear from him now.
And I do hereby declare that John David Pugh is duly elected. Thank you.
I stand here with more than a degree of relief on what is not a very good night for the Liberal Democrats. My party has shown right across the country an enormous amount of heroism in terms of campaigning and working. But unfortunately, that heroism has been made necessary by what were quite serious strategic mistakes made during the early stage of the coalition. And I do hope after this, as a party, we will have learned, and the leadership and the membership of the party will go forward wiser and ready to fight again. Thank you very much.
That's John Pugh, one of a handful of Liberal Democrat survivors from the horrendous night at the polls. Pat Maloney, John Pugh there talking about looking to leadership, looking to the future. Nick Clegg held on to his seat. It's unlikely that he'll hold on to the leadership as if he wanted to. What next for leading the Liberal Democrats out of this abyss into which you have fallen?
I think we need to return to our fundamental values. And if I can make a prediction here, I think the next leader of the Liberal Democrats will be Tim Farron, who's another North West Lib Dem MP. I'm not sure whether he's held his seat. I certainly hope he has.
He has it in Westmoreland.
Right, okay, well, that's my prediction for this morning, that Tim Farron will be the next leader of the party. And I think we need to make sure that the electors know that we are Liberals. We're not pseudo-Tories, we're not pseudo-Labour. We have a distinct Liberal Democrat philosophy, and we need to get back to the grassroots and build up from the ground.
But you probably remember the days in the 1960s when it was said that the Liberal Democrat Westminster group could fit into the back of a cab. You know, a decent-sized minibus would do now. Don't you have a real issue with credibility here, having spent 5 years in partnership with, in coalition with the Conservatives, and that has damaged the Liberal Democrat brand irreparably?
It clearly has damaged the brand. Whether or not it's irreparably, I would actually dispute. And if we go back to 2010 and look at the state the country was in then, there was a worldwide economic crisis. If we remember, Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal and Ireland were in a deep financial crisis. And Britain was, the path out of that recession was by no means clear. And what was very important at that time was that there was political stability in order to be able to lead the country out of that mess. Now, it can be argued that the Liberal Democrats actually sacrificed their own party for the good of the country. And I think that is the case. Now, clearly we have got to start rebuilding. I think we've got a history, we've got a tradition that will be resonant with the electorate in the future, but we have got a lot of hard work to do.
Patrick, you'll know that there's a huge amount of ill feeling between Labour and the Liberal Democrats in this city of Liverpool and more widely. Come on, deep down, do you feel a little bit sorry for them today?
I have a lot of time for Pat. On a personal level, great bloke. On a political level, Pat has just said about getting back to Liberal values. I think we've actually seen what Liberal values are over the last 5 years. They're actually neoliberal values. You can't really get a cigarette paper between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives on a lot of economic issues. Everything that the Liberal Democrats said that they had done financially and economically and fiscally in government, George Osborne then said, oh, I agree with that too. So when you're saying that Liberal values should be at the forefront, people have seen what Liberal values actually are in practice. People have decisively turned their back on them. That's not the approach we need for the country.
Pat, at some point in this campaign, Nick Clegg said that the Liberal Democrats were there to give a Tory government or a Tory party a heart and a Labour Party a head. Isn't it the case that essentially you've had the guts torn out of your party?
Clearly, we've had a very difficult election and the results have been catastrophic for the party. However, I think if you look at the public perception of the Lib Dems, it's been largely that we're a party of moderation, and certainly we are not extreme right-wingers and we're not extreme left-wingers. We look, I mean, the Conservative policies have been very right-wing, and in government, I think the Liberal Democrat MPs have moderated the Tory policies, and I think we're going to see a firestorm now of extreme right-wing reaction by the Conservatives, who are running scared of UKIP, and I think the possibility of Britain exiting from the EU could be absolutely economically, socially and politically disastrous for the UK and disastrous even for the Union, because if that does happen, then I think Scotland is in even greater danger of leaving the United Kingdom.
Well, it's an interesting point you make there. Patrick Hurley, do you think that it's likely that in the next couple of years you'll be teaming up with the Lib Dems, those who are left, to campaign to stay within the EU and to campaign for the United Kingdom to stay united? Are we going to see a kind of strange alliance forming, do you think, in the months and years to come?
I'll certainly be devoting my time and effort over the next few years to campaigning against what the Conservatives have planned for the country, which is taking the country out of the EU, which is effectively dividing the UK between England and Wales and Scotland. Whether the Liberal Democrats want to join in that campaign, that's entirely up to them.
Okay. Time perhaps to run through some of the results around our city region. In the city of Liverpool itself, there were Labour victories for Luciana Berger in Liverpool Wavertree, for Steve Rotherham in Liverpool Walton, as Pat can testify. And interesting, I think Walton is now the safest Labour seat in the country because Mr Rotherham secured over 81% of the vote there, so that's a huge win for him. The Garston and Halewood seat was held by Maria Eagle. Louise Ellman won Liverpool Riverside, where Martin Dobson came second for the Greens. We hope to hear from him a little later on. And in Liverpool West Derby, victory went to Stephen Twigg. Stephen Twigg used to be the member for Enfield Southgate, famously overcame Michael Portillo in the 1997 general election. No such drama at last night's count, a pretty comfortable win for Stephen Twigg in Liverpool West Derby. Pat, sorry, there's two Patricks. There's a Pat and a Patrick. Patrick Hurley, when you look at the performance of the party in the city, Joe Anderson, the Mayor of Liverpool, spent a lot of time cultivating connections with central government over things like HS2, over things like devolution. And yeah, there are divisions between you and the Conservatives. But I wonder whether you think that era of collaboration may be over, given the fact that you're going to have a Conservative government, by the look of it, unhindered, unconstrained by Liberal Democrat partners.
If the Conservatives know what's in their own interests, they've seen that, well, really for the last 20, 25 years, they've not been able to break into the great cities of the north of England. If they want to change that, the only way that they're going to be able to do that is by giving us the autonomy to make our own decisions, is by investing in our infrastructure. And I'm sure that it's in George Osborne's self-interest, if he remains Chancellor, to come to a sensible deal for Liverpool and the wider region. Yeah, Joe Anderson has done exactly the right thing in negotiating with the central government that's been in place over the last 5 years. I'm sure that approach, which is providing, but it's bearing fruit, it should continue, and I'm sure it will.
I don't know whether you heard Boris Johnson talking earlier today, saying that one of the priorities for the new government was devolution to the cities and the regions of England. So he and Mr Cameron and Mr Anderson indeed seem to be talking from the same hymn sheet. I just want to return to the contest in Liverpool West Derby, where Stephen Twigg was victorious, and we can hear from him now.
I think the priority now is to make sure that Liverpool gets a much better deal from government that it's had over these last 5 years. If we look at the devolution deal that Greater Manchester has had from the government, I want Liverpool to get that kind of deal. I want more power and resources to be determined by local communities, local councils here on Merseyside, rather than those decisions being taken in Whitehall and Westminster. This is the second election in which Liverpool has bucked the trend, because we had swings to Labour in 2010 as well. And my experience is very clear. There is an hostility to the Conservatives that is based on the 1980s. It's based on what Thatcherism did to this great city in that time. People rightly have long memories, and there is a real support for Labour, but also a real sense that people do not want the Tories in power in London. The number of times over the last 6 weeks that people have said to me, "Go for it, Stephen, get rid of them," and they mean the Tories. And whilst that may be felt to an extent in other parts of the country, I think it's felt especially strongly here in Liverpool because of what Margaret Thatcher did here in the 1980s.
Patrick Hurley, picking up on some of the things that Stephen Twigg has said there. The figures suggest that Liverpool City Council, of which you are a member, at least for now, is going to face more cutbacks, smaller grants, more austerity. Your colleague Stephen Twigg warning there that the consequences of that could be disastrous for the city. Should we be adopting the brace position as a city?
We've seen what the Tories can do, even supposedly with Liberal Democrat influence over the past 5 years. Their spots hadn't changed since the 80s and the 90s. As soon as they got back into government in 2010, they implemented more cuts to city budgets. They sucked investment out of the region. I fully expect that to continue over the next 5 years. The cuts that we've seen specifically in Liverpool City, we've managed quite well. We've kept libraries open. We've kept leisure centres open. We've kept children's centres open. Those tasks are going to be proven to be much more difficult over the next 5 years if the current Conservative, Liberal Democrat economic policies continue.
Patrick Hurley, Pat Maloney, thank you very much for the time being. We have a lot more ground to cover. We'll be looking at constituencies in the Wirral, in Sefton, in Warrington, North and South, and casting our net wide across the Liverpool City region and into North Wales and Cheshire and beyond. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back to the Bay TV Liverpool Vote 2015 election special. I'm Liam Fogarty, and we're conducting a kind of post-mortem, I suppose, on last night's general election results across our city region. How you feel about it depends on maybe how you voted, if you voted. Taking a look at a couple of today's papers, the Daily Mail, Cameron, quote unquote, heading back to number 10, which seems to be how it's going. The Daily Mirror, 5 more damned years. So there you go. I'm joined in the studio by James Pearson. James stood for the Conservative Party in the Liverpool Wavertree seat. James, you're very welcome. You didn't win in Wavertree. That wasn't the biggest surprise. But the Conservative Party has had an unexpectedly strong, perhaps amazing performance. Your reaction?
It's been a brilliant night. I've been around in politics for a reasonable amount of time, but I've never actually seen a Conservative government take power from a Labour government. Now, we haven't quite got that here. We've gone from sort of a coalition. But if the latest updates, including Ed Balls losing his seat, are anything to go by, it should be David Cameron back with a majority, which is not something that either the exit polls predicted earlier on tonight, this morning. But yeah, I mean, I'm very pleased overall.
You mentioned the polls, and they were pointing towards a dead heat. They were pointing towards a hung parliament. What do you think happened in the last 24 hours of the campaign?
Well, it's been. I don't think Labour's had a sort of Sheffield moment. I don't think that's happened in the same way that it did in 1992. But people had to look really long and hard about whether they could consider Ed Miliband to be a credible Prime Minister. But not just that, I mean, not only have they said they don't trust him to be Prime Minister, you know, Ed Balls who's poised on, you know, would have been in Chancellor, is now not even in Parliament. His Shadow Foreign Secretary, again, now not even in Parliament. So it's I've heard things mentioned about sort of shy Tories and things like that, and you know, it's not been the Conservative message to sort of prey on people's fears, but actually, you know, it was about trust, and you know, people have understood and accepted in a way that Ed Miliband refused to do on the national debates, that he overspent, that the Labour Party overspent in the previous government, and that there has been a mess as a result of that.
Well, you mentioned negativity. Certainly the other panellists here reckon the Tories were extremely negative, not least in the way that they, in their words, stirred up concerns about the SNP, about Scotland, and this idea that there'd be chaos and confusion. A, would you agree that that was a fundamental part of your campaign? And B, do you think it worked? Well, it clearly worked.
I don't think it was a fundamental part of the campaign. We had to lay open what the polls were telling us, and the polls were telling us that a SNP Labour coalition or supply and demand agreement or whatever was a possibility. We needed the numbers to get an outright majority. It looks as if we've got that now. But no, I mean, certainly in Nicola Sturgeon's perspective, she was happy to work with Labour. Now, whatever that might look like, and whether Labour deny or whatever, but you know, if you've got a vote on the floor of the House of Commons and you're trying to get your business through, you'll take any support you can get if you're in a minority government. So it's not, you know, it was never going to be the case that if Miliband had become Prime Minister, that he couldn't have accepted support and help from the SNP, and in certain circumstances, that would have come with a price tag.
There is a difference clearly between your party's performance in the country as a whole and your party's performance in places like Liverpool and Merseyside. I mean, you were the candidate in Liverpool Wavertree. Your opponent, Luciana Berger, put an extra 10,000 on her majority.
I think she's quadrupled her majority. I think from I don't know. Pat's the guy with the stats, but I came second. And you know, I've beat the UKIP, I've beat the Liberal Democrats. You know, and if you'd asked me that a year ago, whether that was ever going to be the case, I'd have been very surprised.
But if you get a situation where the big cities of the north of England are turning out for Labour, as they have done, what kind of challenge does that pose to what looks like an incoming Conservative administration under David Cameron?
Well, look, I mean, I grew up in Manchester, and that's always been a Labour city. I'm sort of, you know, lone Tory in South Manchester, but actually we've always found. I mean, I was a councillor on Trafford Council, and you know, it was a Conservative administration, but we always found things being very constructive. I mean, George Osborne's plan, along with Sir Hal Bernstein and Richard Lees in Manchester City Centre, have done business with the government. They've ended up with a huge amount of sort of devolution of powers over the NHS and some of the other things, and they're very much on board with the Northern Powerhouse model that the Chancellor has put forward. It's disappointing that sort of Mayor Joe Anderson and the City Centre hasn't sort of come along on that journey, because business is business. It doesn't really matter what your colours are, that you want the best for your city. And I think you know, the Labour administration here in the city isn't really looking to that bigger picture.
Well, Patrick, you're part of the Labour administration. You're a Labour councillor on Liverpool City Council. Do you recognise this picture that James has painted?
I don't recognise it at all. The Labour City Council in Liverpool has been very open to the devolution agenda. It's been very open to greater autonomy, greater decision-making capability and capacity. We've not managed to achieve that yet. I don't think that the reason for that is down to Liverpool City Council or the Mayor of Liverpool or the councillors within the city. There are other reasons as to why that might not be the case. I don't think the blame can be laid at our door, though.
James, your political opponents in this city region have said that a Conservative government means more cuts, more austerity, more reductions in council spending, more damage to local services. Can you put their fears to rest?
I think the counter-argument to that is there's more jobs, more opportunities, more growth in the economy ultimately allows and enables the government to invest in vital services in our country, social services, you know, the NHS. We put at, you know, you have to create the wealth, you have to have an expanding economy in order to be able to spend the money. Where we've let people down in the past, or where the successive governments have let people down in the past, is they've given everybody the idea that you can spend your way out of a problem. You need to set the economic conditions in order to be able to produce growth. Over the last 5 years, we've seen a significant amount of inward investment into Liverpool City Centre, but also in the North West, with over £1 billion worth of private sector investment going into the North West. Now that creates jobs, which creates employment, which gets people out of poverty. You know, all of these things have a knock-on effect. It would be disingenuous to say you can wave a magic wand, you know, tomorrow after David Cameron's come back to seeing the Queen and say, there you go, you know, take what you like. I mean, it's not an option. We've still got a huge economic recovery to make up.
But the election is over, and at this point, Mr. Osborne and Mr. Cameron can now tell us where those £12 billion of welfare cuts are going to fall, can't they?
But it's not black and white, and this was the point with our commitment to increase the NHS spending to by an additional £8 billion by 2020. Those things are reliant on the economy continuing to recover, continuing to grow, to continue to expand to the point where we can balance the books in our we said it within 2 years. Now, as a result of that, when you get more people into work, then they are not claiming benefits. You know, these are simple things. You know, it's those transitions that balance the books. To put it before some people go, well, that means that, you know, £12 billion worth of savings is going to be made tomorrow, and all of these people are at risk. Is the scaremongering that you've accused us of over the SNP? It's just not the case.
Pat Maloney, Liberal Democrats, until quite recently, ran the city of Liverpool. You're a much diminished force now, but you've still got more councillors than the Conservative Party. I'm sorry to remind James about that. Do you think there's a prospect that if James is right and there is prosperity and it's shared and the great northern cities share in that prosperity, that you can have a Tory revival, perhaps at the expense of Liberal Democrats like you?
I don't think there will be a Tory revival. I think one of the problems with the Conservatives is for the last 30, 35 years, there's been an economic policy based on letting the London and South East economy rip to the detriment of the rest of the country. And we are far, far too centralised a nation. The Tories have started to talk about this in terms of decentralisation, in terms of the Northern Powerhouse. However, I think their agenda there is quite clearly to promote city mayors, and we're looking at the Manchester deal being contingent on there being an elected mayor for the Manchester City region against the will of the people. They're not consulting the people just in the way that the Labour Party in Liverpool did not consult the people of Liverpool about whether or not they wanted an elected mayor. That was foisted on the people, and I think we're starting to see the problems that you do get with an elected city mayor or elected mayor for city regions, and that is lack of accountability, lack of actually following the will of the people. And I think, again, to come back to the Conservatives, they have got now, it looks like, an overall majority with a third of the vote. That is not politically legitimate. That does not reflect the will of the people, and we must address how our government is going to reflect the views of the population.
Let's pick up on that point, if I may, James. The percentage of the vote the Conservatives have got across the country wouldn't have delivered anything like a workable majority in pretty much any election over the last 100 years. And as Pat says, 2/3 of the people who voted pretty much didn't vote for David Cameron. And yet David Cameron is going to be our Prime Minister for, you know, the foreseeable future. Is it not time to look again at how we choose our members of Parliament and maybe look at a system that is fairer and more representative?
Well, I don't really see a problem with the current system, because it does produce a decisive result.
This isn't a decisive result.
Well, it's a workable
You've
majority.
barely got a working majority.
But with that comes its challenges, which means that that, you know, for the more controversial things, you know, I've like I said, I grew up in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s with Blair with a massive majority, and it didn't really matter what happened. He just went, you know, his business just went through the floor of the House of Commons with very little scrutiny. I felt anyway, and there were all sorts of things that were done then that we had Scottish Labour MPs voting, or, you know, to introduce tuition fees in England, you know, stuff like that just didn't really stuck in the quill for me. You're always going to say that with proportional representation, you know, you're detaching an individual from a parliamentary constituency, and again, that's not really a way forward. We did have the alternative vote referendum, I think 4 years ago, as part of the coalition agreement, and you know, Britain, you know, people had a choice, and they decided they didn't want to alter the current system. So I think you have to respect that as well.
Patrick Hurley, first past the post works well for Labour in Liverpool. You keep on racking up these enormous majorities and hold pretty much 80-90% of the seats on the council. But are there not a lot of people in your party now who are going to look at this result, look at the underrepresentation of UKIP, for instance, look at what's happened in Scotland? You know, you've got one non-SNP member of Parliament in Scotland. Is the case for a new voting system gaining ground in your party, the Labour Party?
James mentioned how first past the post brings forward a decisive result, but then in the next breath James then said, there are huge problems with it because you can railroad legislation through Parliament. That just shows how first past the post, you can really place whatever you want onto that voting system. You can make an argument in favour of it, you can make an argument against it, and you can make the two arguments simultaneously, as James has just done. What I think needs to happen is that the will of the people needs to be respected. The will of the people is not David Cameron as Prime Minister. 35%, 36%, maybe less than that. That's not a majority, and he shouldn't be having a majority in Parliament.
So do you fall on the side of people who want reform, who want to change to the system?
Reform, I was opposed to the AV referendum. I thought that was the wrong system. But the problem was, if you put the wrong question to people, they will give you the wrong answer. So,
well, as Peter Mandelson said in the issue, you can't leave it to the lottery of the electorate, and I think that's rather arrogant and high-handed. But I mean, let's not forget, in 2009, in the northwest of England, people elected Nick Griffin as our MEP, and he legitimately sat in the European Parliament as a representative of the northwest of England. Now, I don't think, sort of the vast majority of people didn't vote for him, but he was there as our representative. And again, I'm not convinced that was a good thing either.
No, it certainly wasn't. But the same can be said about everybody who is elected under whatever system you choose. Nobody around this panel wanted Nick Griffin to be
It's always the case that the losing party complain about the system. But
there's obviously a spring in your step this morning.
Yeah, of course. 2009, Nick Griffiths wasn't the only North West MEP. He was one of the North West MEPs. Sure. And enough people at that stage voted for him to actually become an MEP.
Yes.
There were a large number of Conservatives, there were a large number of Labour, and there were some Lib Dem MPs. That system, and I'm not proposing the party list system, I don't think it's the best way forward. But if we're going to talk about democracy is the will of the people, now you said first past the post gives a decisive result. If you want a decisive result, the ultimate decisive result is a dictatorship, and that's not democratic. But it is decisive. And if we're going to reflect the will of the people, there isn't a single view of the British population, and we need a plurality of views in order to be able to reflect, to debate, to scrutinise. And I think the system we've seen in Liverpool, where we've got one mayor who ignores the council. The council, Liverpool City Council, 90 councillors, very diverse, lots of different background, lots of different views, even though it's overwhelmingly Labour. Whereas now we have a single mayor, and he decides, and he doesn't have to take into account anybody else's views. That is not healthy.
There was a decisive result last night in Liverpool, and that decisive result was for the Labour Party.
Right.
Gentlemen, I must stop you there, because there have been quite a few decisive results. We'd like to try and cover as many as we can. And one of them was in the Garston and Hale Wood constituency, where Maria Eagle of the Labour Party was defending her seat. And she increased her majority up from just under 17,000 to a whacking 27,000. Let's hear from Maria Eagle.
Well, it's a stunning vote of confidence from the people of Garston and Halewood. It's the biggest majority I've ever had. Out and about on the campaign trail, and especially today, people were willing me on and willing Labour on to win. So I feel very humbled. I mean, 26,000 and something majority, bigger than my majority in 1997 by far. So, I mean, I've now got a huge job to do for the people of Garston and Halewood to defend and protect their interests in Parliament. We're going to have a very interesting Parliament. It's not clear yet what it's going to be precisely. There's a lot of results still to come. But one thing that is clear is there have been some seismic shifts going on around the country. We're going to have to see what the fallout is and what the consequence for the government that's currently in office is, and whether or not that will remain or something different will happen. So it's some momentous political changes potentially happening over the next 5 years.
That's Maria Eagle, the victor in the constituency of Garston and Halewood, talking about a seismic shift and momentous events, momentous results. James Pearson, the Conservative Party, is the chief beneficiary of this seismic shift. You're going to form the next government. But I wonder whether one of your first tasks is to try and kind of make peace with people in Scotland and the north of England who actually have rejected the Conservative Party, in a pretty direct and decisive way.
I mean, take Scotland as a separate case. I would say, the Conservatives haven't, although we've had an input in the Scottish Parliament and things. We don't have a huge following in the same way that we enjoyed in the 1980s, and also in the past. What I would say is that in certain constituencies across the northwest, we've held our own. There've been a couple of disappointing results from us, but actually on balance, those Conservatives in marginal seats have hung on to them, and I think that's a very positive message.
Patrick Hurley, Labour spent a lot of time warning people that the NHS was under threat. We had 24 hours to save the NHS, or whatever the turn of phrase was. Does the party have to evaluate its strategy, its principles, or has it just suffered a tactical defeat?
You know what you're gonna get with the Tories on the NHS. We saw it in 2011. We saw it in 2012 with the top-down reorganisation of the whole organisation. I fear for the future of the NHS, and that's not an exaggeration, I really do. What I think the implications of that are for the Labour Party is that we need to reach outside of our comfort zone. We need to go out and talk to people about more than just things that we're strong on. We need to make sure that what we're talking about chimes with the public mood, and obviously we didn't get that right this year.
I mean, every speech that Ed Miliband gave was mentioning these hard-working families and mentioning the NHS. Do you think after a while, people stop listening? They kind of tune out. They think, oh, yeah, that's Labour. Yeah, we know that they do that sort of thing. OK. But you need another message. You need to be a bit more small c Catholic, I suppose, with a wider range of options people can consider.
Yeah, we need a big tent approach. The approach that we had back in the mid to late 90s, where people were actually on our side in a lot of senses, and the way that people thought that we were on their side as well. The way that Labour was running the country back in 97, 98, 99 worked for the vast majority of people, and I think we need to get back to that.
So do you think you basically ran a core vote strategy to get out your core vote, and we learned that your core is smaller than James's party's core?
I think that's a fair approach, a fair thing to say.
Back to the results from general election 2015, and there was a forecast at the start of this campaign that there would be a Green Party surge, at least nationally. That didn't quite happen, but here in the city of Liverpool, the Greens did pretty well, getting more votes than ever before, and in fact they finished second in the Liverpool Riverside constituency, where their candidate was Martin Dobson, and we can hear from him now.
It's been very encouraging night for us. We were never going to do very well. It's a safe Labour seat after all, Liverpool Riverside. But to come second place for the Green Party is a great achievement, and to do so well in many of the wards. I feel we've got an increased vote, massive support for the party during the election campaign, and feel it sets us well placed for moving forward the next few local council elections.
Well, that was the Greens. There have been, quite a few new faces introduced to Parliament as a result of yesterday's vote. Bit of a run through, really. In the city of Chester, Chris Matheson is the new Labour MP. He beat Stephen Mosley. Justin Madders has won for Labour in Ellesmere Port and Neston. He's a prominent local councillor. Conor McGinn has won for Labour in the safe seat of St Helens North. He's 30. He comes from Northern Ireland and is a special advisor in the Labour Party. Mary Rimmer, a much more familiar face, former leader of St Helens Council, elected in St Helens South and Whiston. Vale of Clwyd, James Davies has gained that seat for the Conservatives from Chris Ruane, the outgoing Labour member, and perhaps the most prominent victor of the night in our part of the world, Margaret Greenwood, taking Wirral West for the Labour Party, defeating Esther McVeigh in the process. One new face as an MP is a familiar face, and he is the new Member of Parliament for Bootle, one of the safest Labour seats in the country, and so it's proved. The new MP is Peter Dowd, and we've been speaking to him.
Well, I want to concentrate on making sure that we get economic regeneration in our area, that we protect the NHS, and that we sort of try to get our young people in the education services to take that education through to jobs and job security.
I'd like to congratulate Peter. I hope he enjoys his new job. You get a fair deal for the people of Bootle, they deserve it.
And I'd like to thank everybody who participated in the election, not just those people who voted for me, but for everybody who took part, and all my colleagues and friends who fought. So it's a nice feeling, and I just want to savour it for a day or two before we get on with the proper work I need to do.
That's the outcome in Bootle, where Peter Dowd is the new Labour Member of Parliament. We heard briefly there from Paul Nuttall from UKIP. No seats for UKIP, more votes, but no representation in Parliament from the city region. The last word, I think, has to go to our Conservative panellist, James Pearson. You've won a majority. It looks like it's barely a majority. In 10 seconds, what is David Cameron's priority for this region and for this country?
For this region, it's to continue our economic plan, it's to get investment into the region, it's to create jobs, it's to develop our region and sort our economy out.
James, Patrick and Pat, thank you so much. I'm Liam Fogarty.